How are you?
I'm in Warsaw, joining to that tonight today. Whatever you are, guys, joining us. I'm joining from Warsaw, and actually had a meeting, fantastic meeting with one of our featured guests from the last episodes, Victor. And I found myself in at one point in a fantastic circle of people, and journalists and activists from Central Asia. And this is, of course, not the first time I find myself in such company, but it was first time that the dynamic was completely different because of Ukraine. And it was a bit inspiring because we all we could talk about is how to end Russian colonialism once and for all, and how people are fired up, and not only because they feel and they care and empathize with Ukraine, but because this is something that puts fire under every person who knows what Russian colonialism is and what violence it does to
Yeah.
everyone it touches.
I hope it restored some energy for all of you, and you're ready to continue doing what we've been doing for I don't know how long now, but that sounds. I'm jealous.
Yeah, one small thing actually to say all of that. These days, as we see, I mean, we have a radio silence regarding Kherson, but we also see heroic things that Ukrainian armed forces are doing in eastern Ukraine, defending Bakhmut, defending other eastern Ukrainian cities. At the end of the day, you realize that nothing, literally nothing, will matter if Ukraine and our armed forces fail.
Yeah.
And these days, it's more prominent than ever, this thought. So I encourage everyone else to spread the word and also support in any way you can the defense of Ukrainian democracy.
Yeah, and in the Ukrainian Twitter, well, some of you who are joining are from Ukraine, and others who have been following news around Ukraine, every time in Ukrainian Twitter or Facebook or anywhere people feel like tired or burnt out or upset or angry or something, someone says like, oh, just like instead of doing that, donate to the armed forces. So that's quite indicative of just like how much people push through and how much people have sort of the willpower to keep going. So that sounds yeah, thanks for sharing that, Maksym, as well.
You okay?
Yeah, I'm also okay. I know we're talking about Ukraine, but it's just been quite nice to have a bit of a distraction in the shape of the UK to just today. But sometimes we need like a tiny bit of escapism. I think I do for sure. So that's been I've been watching the video of the lettuce on live YouTube to just distract myself a bit.
Look, for everyone else who's joining for the first time, maybe we can explain what Ukrainian Spaces is and maybe how it's sometimes different for season two.
Yeah.
Would you mind doing that, or
Yeah, of course.
shall I?
I can quickly summarize it because I want us to get to our wonderful guests for the majority of the hour today. But for those of you who are joining us for the first time, and for those of you who are joining us not for the first time, I just wanted to remind everyone what we're about. So Maksym and I started this no, more than 6 months ago, because we were seeing basically millions of Ukrainians with perfect English share their stories across social media, but even now, 6 months in, I think it's more than 6 months. I apologize. A lot of the conversation about Ukraine seem to still be dominated by Western pundits and theoreticians on the topic. So we wanted to elevate Ukrainian voices and show the world, how many amazing, diverse experts we have within Ukraine. Not just experts, but just people from different walks of life. But season two, we've really tried to broaden that, and we've tried to include bridge episodes because we realized how important it was both for Ukrainians and also for other people who have went through similar things to show that common sort of solidarity between our causes. And so we've been doing bridge episodes between Ukrainian voices and other people which you have seen from other places. You have seen over the past month that we've been doing. And today we are doing one with our amazing guests to talk about the Middle East and Ukraine.
Before we introduce them, I wanted also just to send huge thanks to our Patreon sponsors. Ukrainian Spaces is 100% independent and listener supported. So we're here today thanks to our Patreon family, dozens and dozens of people who support us every day to make sure that we can grow, we can do better, we can find the time and resources to amplify as many of Ukrainian voices and Ukrainian allies' voices as possible during these times, and to center Ukraine into conversations about genocide in Ukraine. So, yeah, thank you so much. If you're not a sponsor, please check our Patreon page, because our sponsors get lots of additional cool stuff, including everyone's favorite, to have a front row seat during our live broadcast when it comes to asking questions to our featured guests themselves, either through us, but this is an exclusive treat that only our Patreon sponsors have. So if you want to, become part of the conversation in that way, yep, you're invited to support us through Patreon. Okay, so I think it's time to introduce our featured guests.
Yeah.
Leila, Joey, can you unmute yourself? Yes.
Yeah.
Because they're going to be from one account, but there are actually two people there. What a treat. Right. So, you guys decide yourself first who goes first, but we follow our golden rule that our featured guests introduce themselves the way they want to introduce themselves. So please do tell us who you are, where you come from, and specifically a little bit whether and how genocide in Ukraine activated an ally in you.
Hi, my name's Leila Al-Shami. I'm a British Syrian activist and the co-author of a book called Burning Countries, Syrians in Revolution and War. It's a pleasure to be here today and reaching out and talking to Ukrainian allies. It's a struggle that Syrians have very much identified with, and I'm sure through this discussion we're going to go much more into depth as to why those issues are.
Mm-hmm. Hi, so my name is Joey. I'm Lebanese Palestinian, grew up in Lebanon, currently based in Europe. And yeah, I guess as Leila said, I suppose we'll have a lot of time to talk about why this has mattered to the both of us individually and also together, and for a lot of friends that we know who are from Syria, from the region really as well, more broadly speaking. And yeah, happy to do this.
Thank you so much both for your introduction. And I wanted to kick us off with a first question to you, but start with sort of, I guess, I've never shared this actually, but when the war started the full-scale invasion started in February, my first reaction, a lot of my family didn't want to leave Kiev at the time, that was like besieged and pretty dangerous to be there still. And my first reaction, I don't know why, but I mean, we'll discuss why now, but was to call my friend's husband, who is Syrian, he's now in the US, and just we spoke with him for about 2 hours, because I just didn't know who else I could talk to apart from him, because I knew that he knew what I felt and could be the only person to give me some, practical advice about how to deal with this on a personal level that I don't think anyone else could have at that point in time, because Ukrainians didn't know what to do, because this was new for many of us, and our friends and colleagues who were from countries that never experienced anything like this also couldn't say anything or help. And I just found so much strength in that one conversation I had with him that I still remember it to this day, and I still talk to him about how things have progressed ever since. But and Joey, I've seen, obviously you've been doing a lot of work as well in activism around Ukraine, and you've been one of the sort of leading voices as well that has been elevating Ukrainian voices and things like that. And Leila, I know we discussed as well that you do a lot of campaigning and work on this. But I was just wondering, like, this is obviously my perspective of a Ukrainian. This was my first reaction to reach out to my Syrian friend and be like, what is going on and how do I deal with life? But what was your sort of first reaction in February when Russia invaded Ukraine full-time, majorly?
Well, I think just from a Syrian perspective, there was an outpouring of solidarity immediately with Ukraine, and I think that's for a number of reasons. First of all, we share a common enemy in Russia, but also the point which you just touched on is we immediately felt the trauma. We immediately identified with what that moment was like for Ukrainians, because we've been going through that now for the past decade. Also, of course, many Syrians were greatly inspired by the uprising in Ukraine in 2014. So it's been nice to see that there has been so much solidarity from Syrians with the Ukrainian struggle.
Yeah, I mean, very similar for me. I immediately was reminded of 2016, and so basically kind of like my worst fear happening again. 2016, I'm referring to the fall of Eastern Aleppo at the time. And as it happens, like about a week ago or something, we found that the Russian general who was one of the leaders of that offensive has also been basically put to task in Ukraine now. And February, I was, I guess, a bit, not surprised, shocked, but not surprised that Putin would actually go through with what he said he was going to go through. Although immediately that was followed by, well, obviously he was going to do this because he tends to do these things and he's done it before. So there was this kind of, I guess I can call it like a roller coaster of emotions happening at the same time. And me, myself, Leila, a bunch of other folks immediately reached out to Ukrainians that we know. And very quickly, thanks to social media, we were able to find a lot of folks very, very quickly and work with them on certain things, or at least be in touch and show solidarity however we can.
Yeah, and I mean, I have similar stories. Literally, I think many Ukrainians have, because the people who reached out to me the first hours after full-scale invasion escalation were actually Syrian friends. And it was, I mean, of course, there are a lot of people who reached out those days as well with, just check on us, wish well, to double check if everyone's alive. And that keeps happening. And I'm so grateful for it. But when Syrian's friends reach out, they were very particular. It was the most helpful. They were like, look, in the next weeks, months, ABC will happen. This is what you will feel. This is what it's not going to happen. And it was absolutely enormous. I think I'm going to be grateful until the rest of my life, because these kind of advices, they still work to the day. And I think I didn't falter or didn't, end up crippled by all this horror and witness and genocide just because of friends like that. So, but I wanted to, ask you as well, as you were watching the horror unfolding in Ukraine and the horror still unfolding in Syria, this kind of frustration that you guys, and we were as well, because the Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, and for many, many years we've been warning and telling and basically laying out clear guidelines for the rest of the world how to stop it and how to end it. And now our voice has been ignored constantly. So in the last 8 months, do you see that kind of ignorance and that kind of refusal to listen to voices from Syria, Ukraine, and other affected nations? Is this something changing in any way that gives you also maybe a bit of hope? Or
well, there's so many parallels with Syria, but certainly one of the strongest things that I think resonates with us has been the response from the left, from the anti-war movement, which has been very similar. We've seen so much disinformation about what's happening in Syria, much of it coming from Russian state media, where there's been a lot of parallels with Ukraine, and how that disinformation has often been amplified certainly within Western left circles. And a lot of that has been, as you've touched on, the fact that it's attempting to silence or discredit voices from the ground. So yeah, we can definitely relate to that.
Yeah, just to add to that, I guess I was, as with many folks who are the Syrians, who have followed Syria for a long time, some of the victories that we've been seeing, like in Ukraine, as in like some of the successful resistance, has been kind of cathartic in some sense, because in Syria itself, this has not been possible. Syria, for those who don't know, I think most people know the gist of things, first saw an Iranian intervention in the form of both the Iranian army or the Revolutionary Guards, but also various sectarian militias from the region, including from my own country of Lebanon, and I'm speaking of Hezbollah. But that wasn't enough to save the regime, because the regime was, and still is, a deeply unpopular regime in Syria. By the time the Iranians intervened, I think something like, 70% or something of the country was liberated by the regime and essentially self-organized in various forms. But the Iranian intervention wasn't enough, so the Syrian regime had to resort to a Russian intervention, which obviously happened in 2015, and that is what really changed tipped the scales, so to speak, in favor of Bashar al-Assad's regime. And the fact that 2015 happened after 2014, obviously, in Ukraine, for me was one of those early indications that, although I wasn't actively thinking about it at the time because I was just freaking out about Syria, but it was an indication, if you want, in the back of my mind that like this story is not going to end here. Like this is going to lead to something else. And the frustration that I've seen Ukrainians express towards, especially the rest of Europe, towards Western Europe specifically, but also the US and whatnot, for me, like kind of just brought it home that like the enemy is, if you want to put it that way, is not just Russian imperialism, although that's the primary one, but to some extent there's also European cynicism to fight against. And Syrians have to deal with this for a long time, and as we continue on seeing when it comes to like treatments of refugees at the EU's borders, Turkey, Greece, whatnot, clearly this continues to this day.
Yeah. And I was just listening to both of you. I think, especially what Leila was saying as well, like that's definitely something I didn't, and I, due to my own ignorance as well, I didn't realize that was like a thing to be well, I did, of course, but like it just hit me for some reason, like it's never before, sort of the pushback that you were describing as well, that we were getting from certain circles and things like that. And, you know, also the frustration, Joey, as you were saying, with like the world not listening to the fact that we're basically shouting that this is not going to stop on our, you know, here in Syria and Ukraine, like this is going to be an ongoing situation for both of the reasons that you quoted. But I was just wondering, like, are there any practical sort of ways that you have that you can recommend to, I guess, Ukrainians, but also to everyone else listening to, because you've obviously experienced this for much longer than we have, to deal with some of these issues that you've summarized? Because I feel like solutions always give people hope, and I think that's what we definitely need right now.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's very clear that you know, we're seeing the same tactics being used by Russia in Ukraine that were used in Syria, whether that's the bombing of civilian areas, whether that's the utilization of disinformation to discredit opposition forces. And it's very clear that it's been the appeasement of Russia in Syria, in Georgia, in Chechnya, which has emboldened Putin to take the actions that he's taking in Ukraine today. So, you know, that should tell us very clearly that's a time, you know, where we have to kind of find ways to stop this happening again. It's part of a bigger structural issue. It's not just a structural thing to do with the identity of the Russian state and Russian colonialism. But then in terms of practical ways to kind of counter some of the disinformation and the Western apathy that Joey was talking about, you know, it's very frustrating. I think for us, it's been such a traumatic thing that we didn't really expect to have that response, and it really has been the work of trying to amplify as much as possible voices from the ground and trying to build allies, which is why it's so nice to speak to you today. And I think, you know, we are getting more and more allies who realise that there is a fundamental problem within the Western left, maybe, as to how it approaches struggles or it approaches conflict. And there's more and more allies coming into that, people from Hong Kong, you know, Uyghurs from China, people who have experienced this prior to Syria, like Bosnians. So, you know, I think we should work more on identifying who our allies are so that we can really build strength together and try to push forward a common discourse of what a progressive internationalism should look like and how we can really stand in solidarity with people in times of revolutionary struggle or in times of conflict.
My only advice is a quick one, and I think honestly it's something that Ukrainians have already been doing, but it's basically like don't wait for the West to come to its senses, don't ask, like demand, which I actually think Ukrainians have been pretty good at doing, because I know Leila and so many of the friends of ours who have, like, honestly, we came together around Syria and around the helplessness we felt, especially, well, honestly, for the past decade, most of that past decade. We were very happy to see that Ukrainians immediately understood that, like, this is not gonna go away with appeasement, because at every step of the way we saw Western powers, and obviously referring to Germany, but referring to so many other, if not the states officially themselves, but definitely like, you know, parties and politicians within those states, but also media figures, pundits, what have you, basically saying, you know, well, Ukraine should just give up this, or Ukraine should just do this, and always coming from the perspective that it's Ukraine that has to do something and not the one that's actually invading. And I was very happy to see that, I don't know if the term is happy, but I was comforted to see that Ukrainians were not buying it. Like there was just demand, and Zelensky himself constantly going to wherever he has to go, speaking to whoever he needs to talk to, just say these things like, we need this, we need that, we need weapons, we need money, we need weapons, and just repeating it time and time again, and not letting the politics of, especially in Western Europe, because I'm based in Switzerland, which is constantly about, like, why are they still talking? Why are they still complaining? Why is this thing not over? Like, essentially, like, as if it's just an inconvenience, you know, like, and this is something that I obviously saw on Syria, and I did have some hope that on Ukraine it will be a bit different because of proximity. And I would say, thankfully, so far, although there is still a lot of cynicism and still a lot of folks who do not want to think about it, and, you know, and so on, that enough pressure continues to this day, and you know, for which is for the better of us all, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that's what every Ukrainian also does these days. I think, like, in every situations, everyone find it themselves, especially those who are abroad, and especially those who you know, advocate and talk about it. But even like in normal human situations, you end up in a company of people who are not Ukrainians. So first of all, this is not something that many of us would like to do these days, because suddenly there are some people who would be uncomfortable with you being even present, because I think it's something that lots of Syrians would also tell me before, that this is the only thing you want to talk about, and you want people to pay attention to it, and you use every breath you take and every opportunity to remind people that this genocide is ongoing, and people are dying, and people you love and care about, you know, might die every second, every minute, and people should talk about it. But people, like, dismiss you, saying, you know, that as if it's uncomfortable for them and annoying. So I wanted, guys, to ask you something regarding this, because I have one concern. I have kind of on top of 100,000 anxieties that I already have. But when I see Russia basically using identical tactics at terrorizing civilian populations, leveling our cities to the ground, hitting residential buildings, killing civilians right and left. One of the things that I learned from Syria that was shocking for me and still like, horrific when they hit, for example, apartment building, right? And then rescuers come and they do this is horrific term for a double tap when they hit the same place again to kill rescuers as well, which they keep doing in places like Syria as well.
Yeah.
I'm concerned because I saw how people first were very shocked to see those stories from Syria, but with time, when they happen over and over again, lots of people who have no connections to Syria personally, they kind of normalize it in their heads.
Yeah.
So, do you think it's possible to change, or how you personally find the strength to return people's attention, not specifically only on Russia's tactics, but keeping their attention that they should do something about it rather than being annoyed?
Well, I mean, I try to always have hope, even if I don't actively feel it. Like as a general principle, you might say. Honestly, for me, the lesson of Syria is that no matter the facts on the ground, there will always be a lot of people, and crucially people of influence, people in power and so on, who will read things differently. To just re-give that very quick example, like for example, the fact that in 2013 most of Syria was liberated did not factor into the calculations, if you want, of politicians and governments and whatnot. It was still assumed that Bashar al-Assad still had some kind of power, still have some kind of monopoly, still some kind of hegemony of power, and so on and so forth. And so essentially, and not just that, but Bashar al-Assad's entire thing from the very beginning was to call everyone a terrorist, those are foreign funded, blah, 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 that sort of narrative, which is very similar, obviously, to Putin and the whole, like, Ukrainians are Nazis, blah, 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 all of that stuff. Unfortunately, with Syria, many folks on both the right and unfortunately on the left as well believe that. And of course, in Ukraine, as we see now, many folks want to believe that as well. And how to change those people's minds, I don't know. I think what we can do is maintain enough of a spotlight, so to speak, or enough attention, enough pressure, you might say, to make sure that those smears, which is what they are at the end, don't have a direct impact on the ground. And by direct impact, I mean specifically on the capacity, for example, of the Ukrainians to fight back against Russia. Because that's one like the discourse, the battle discourse, let's say, that's one battle, and it's an important one. But I think with Syria, we learned the hard way that it's not the only battle, obviously. Not that most Syrians don't already know this, but it's something that I think we had to learn, like Syrians had to learn the hard way as well. But it shouldn't necessarily be the priority either. There will be lots of folks, like even with Bosnia, to this day, there are people who deny the genocide. That you're not going to convince everyone. But what you can do is make sure that those who are committing these atrocities, or try and make sure that those who commit these atrocities are either stopped or weakened or whatnot, which is why in Ukraine we're seeing, thankfully, the Ukraine is managing to at least fight back to some extent.
I mean, in terms of trying to keep attention and engagement and solidarity with what's happening in the ground in something which is, an incredibly traumatic time, and when there's a lot of daily horrors, a lot of daily atrocities, which I do think leads to kind of war fatigue. Something that I've always tried to do through my activism is try to raise positive stories from the ground, to talk about how in these incredibly difficult circumstances people were self-organising in their communities, building revolutionary councils in which they could provide to their communities, the inspiring women's centres that were being set up, these kind of things, because I think sometimes it's easier to get engagements and solidarity through positive stories, something people can relate to, can identify with, and think, that's something that I can support. I might not know how I can stop the Russian war machine. I think, it's too big for us as individuals to maybe feel that we have any power over Russia, or in our case, power over Iran. But we do really have a power to make a difference to people's lives on the ground by standing in solidarity with the many amazing initiatives which are happening.
I think that's so important to keep remembering to elevate stories of hope as well, and all this, horror and tragedy, because it's what keeps us going. And I think Ukrainians have learned a lot from Syrians and other people who have experienced war in the Middle East and elsewhere as well, which has given us the correct tools to be able to talk about these stories and elevate them as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to, since our episode is of course about Syria, but also more broadly about Middle East, I wanted to ask Joey about specifically sort of what is sort of the overwhelming narrative or feeling within Lebanon about what's happening in Ukraine, and maybe, I know this might open a lot of questions, but just in general, broader in the Middle East, and to both you and Leila, how can Ukrainians sort of bring more people on board with what's happening with our struggle, just in general, any helpful tips or advice for how we can move the needle on this a little bit in terms of solidarity and support, which I know works both ways.
Of course. In terms of how the general mood, it's just such a big question in some sense. What I can say is this very boring journalistic answer, which is that it depends on who you talk to. I don't think that there is an overwhelming support for Russia. I do think that there is an overwhelming apathy or I think is a result of helplessness, because the Middle East and North Africa, for the most part, are not democracies. People have been for a long time now, especially after the Arab Spring and the crushing of the Arab Spring. There is a sense of like, well, my opinion doesn't really matter. And so if that's kind of the standpoint that you start from, you may not even actively think about a situation. You may empathize, you may say that, well, this is obviously bad and this is obviously sad. You can even conclude, let's say that, well, clearly Russia is the aggressor and so on and so forth. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you will act on it, especially if you live in a country like Egypt or, obviously Yemen or in the Gulf Arab countries or Iraq or whatnot, where you may have like other priorities in front of you because the living situation isn't exactly good. So that's on one. But the caveat to that is that when I said like it depends who you talk to, is that a lot of us are in exile, and it's just a reality, especially after the Arab Spring. And those folks they tend to have a bit more resources because they're not immediately a threat as they would if they were in Yemen or Egypt or whatnot. And those folks might actually be more mentally available, let's put it that way, to talk and think about Ukraine. And that's actually what's going to happen, I think, this Saturday in Berlin. A friend of ours, Wafan Mustafa, among other folks in Berlin, she's a Syrian activist whose father was forcibly disappeared several years ago now by the Assad regime. She is, and again, other folks are organizing with Ukrainians, with Iranians, with, I think, Palestinians and Iraqis and a few other folks to just come together in solidarity against oppression, and all of that, and specifically in this case to, I think, talk about Iran because of what's happening in Iran. So that's just an example. Like in those spaces, you won't necessarily have everyone coming into these spaces, agreeing on everything or sharing everything or whatnot, but they will have a certain shared sensitivity, if you can put it that way. And those spaces, whether it's the protests, whether it's the discussions that follow the protests, that sort of thing, those are the ones that can lead usually to something more long term. In fact, Leila and I are currently at a amazing festival here in Montreuil, next to Paris in France, called Les Peuples Veulent, so like the people want, but in the plural. And we've been chatting with like Sri Lankans, with Iraqis, with Ukrainians, with like really lots of folks from Latin America and from all over the world, Burkina Faso and so on, about like, what are these things that we have in common? What are these things that we don't have in common, because not every story is the same? And how can we build, as Leila said before, like how can we build solidarity and create opportunities and bonds and so on that have not been created so far?
Yeah. I was, because you started talking about the perception that it is in general in the region of what is happening in Ukraine. And I think we always try to address this big elephant in the room, how Ukraine is not often able to reach a lot of folks in the global south and also in Middle East, to recruit as much empathy and solidarity that we might have in the countries surrounding Ukraine. Partially because lots of folks in Global South think of Ukraine as part of the Western white kind of issues world. Although we keep repeating that first, Ukraine is has a lot of diversity, but second, despite that most people are white, they don't enjoy the same white privileges, never been. But in your opinion, like when we face with a lot of, and partially Joey also talked about it, that there is a bit of lack of desire to engage, not that necessarily people don't care, but also, do you feel like there's something that either Ukrainians or we all together can do better to change it in a way? Because I know that Ukrainians are trying, and to be honest, as a Ukrainian, I think I have the right to say that we were quite shitty at expressing our solidarity with many other people with similar situations before, and Ukrainians wouldn't care as much before. Now it is changing. Now you can see even during genocide, we spent time to express support for protests in Iran. There is at least I think, a lot of support for Syrian friends and other places that are affected by tyrannies and also Russian colonialism. But sorry, I'm digressing here. But do you guys think that this is something we can all, like at least Ukrainians, can do better to address this situation and get more allies from Global South and including from Middle East, because we also have, not in Syria, but in other countries, lots of problems with recruiting people on our side.
So, okay, let me just preface this by saying that for me, the Arab Spring, and I'm using Arab Spring as a shorthand, I don't want to say it's only Arab because obviously there were Kurds and lots of other folks. Let's say the 2011 uprisings were immediately followed, especially as of roughly 2013, by what we call like the by like the counter-revolutionary phase. By that I mean, like in Egypt, the revolution was crushed, and obviously you saw the advent of the dictatorship, which is ongoing to this day. And of course in Syria is when we really started seeing the intervention of Iran kind of picking up pace really intensively in 2013 and then 2014 again. And as I said, this wasn't sufficient, so Russia had to intervene in 2015. Now, what that has done, whether it is with Egypt and the military dictatorship, whether it is in Bahrain, whose revolution was also crushed with the help of Saudi tanks, is that it sort of sent a message, whether in Syria, etc., and so on, as I said, in Iraq as well. Iraq is an ongoing situation, and so on, is that might is the final word. If you will crush a revolution, the revolution will stay crushed. Now, one thing that I think we're seeing now, and it's actually extraordinary from a Syrian point of view, if I can put it that way, is that both Russia is encountering a lot of difficulties, to be very euphemistic about it, in Ukraine, and also in Iran, the Iranian regime is actually facing the biggest threat it has ever faced, at least in my lifetime. This can have and probably will have very concrete consequences for Syria and for the region, for Syria and Iraq, especially in Lebanon to a lesser extent, but as well, and probably for the wider region as well, because it can send a message that, well, the bullies don't have to constantly be winning. And so I don't want to predict the future, and I don't want to be that person who's overly optimistic, although I'm rarely accused of that, I think. But if the resistance in Ukraine manages to continue, and I think we can all hope and even believe that it will continue the way it has been continuing so far, I think this will inevitably have some kind of effect on the ground in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon. Not that this is the only factor. Obviously, there are lots of other factors, Turkey, in Syria, and so on and so forth. But it's a major factor, and it's a factor that, as it happens, is happening, both factors, as in Iran and Russia, are happening at the same time. So it's been terrifying and scary and saddening in Iran as well to see. But part of me is feeling like very cautiously optimistic that something might come out of this.
Yeah, I share that sentiment. I mean, both what's happening in Ukraine and in Iran, it's very difficult to see because we identify with what the people there are going through, but it does also provide us with some hope. I mean, it was great to see when there's been Russian pilots or generals that were captured in Ukraine that were decorated for their bombing raids in Syria. Mm-hmm. We were celebrating. We see your victories as our victories, and it really does show you that we are connected, people are connected, and our freedom is dependent on the freedom of others.
I mean, yeah, just to go back to that cathartic point, I mean, the fact that that general is now, I forgot Sergei something, I think, is now in Ukraine, immediately lots of Syrian friends, myself and others, so many was like, well, I hope he, what happened to others will happen to him as well. Like, I hope Ukraine, enacts some kind of justice, because we're not seeing any other forms of justice.
Yeah. We were just doing some research as well on him, and I think this, I mean, I don't want to talk about him much because we're talking about us and not the mm-hmm. other side, mm-hmm. but he essentially, when people say oh wow, Russia is bombing all these Ukrainian cities, but actually it's a strategic tactic and policy they've been using for such a long time, completely destroying civilian cities from mm-hmm. the air that we've seen in Syria for such a long time, that it's just it's not something that changed all of a sudden, it's not all of what we've seen in recent months. It's not new policy that all of a sudden Russia has started, but actually if people paid enough attention when Russia was doing this in Syria and elsewhere, mm-hmm. well, in Syria mostly, with the example of this particular general that you mentioned, we probably wouldn't have been where we are today. And it's just sad to understand that, but also I guess it's good that we are having these conversations because we can learn about how to help those, because I personally, like you said, don't think it's going to stop on Ukraine. Well, I hope mm-hmm. it will, but if we don't stop him here, it's not going to stop. So it's just important to think that. But Maksym and I were talking about this the other day, and we basically have seen that Russia is quite obsessed with actually hijacking the sort of anti-imperial, anti-colonial narrative mm-hmm. and saying how anti-imperial and anti-colonial they are, and how they fight back against Western forces, and how they represent the freedom of all these people who have been oppressed and colonized.
They're victims of colonialism.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a
new
term.
But we were just wondering, to Leila and both of you, why do you think they're so obsessed with hijacking this narrative? Why do you think they feel the need to?
I think because it works mm-hmm. and because it resonates with a certain type of audience. I think the Russian state is very well practiced in honing its messages for different audiences, and it appeals in the West both to the far right and to the far left. And mm-hmm. to the far left, it very much uses the discourse of anti-imperialism in a way which makes this word so meaningless, so devoid of any content, because it's an imperial action is being carried out in the name of anti-imperialism. So, but yeah, it's because it works and it does resonate with people, sadly.
And it's also it's the title of Peter Pomerantsev's book. What is it? Nothing is true and
nothing is possible. Nothing is true. Everything is possible.
Exactly, and that suggests that essentially the tactic, and I think we know this by now. It's very well documented. The tactic of the Russian state, although now they have a much greater difficulty doing so since RT has been having lots of troubles and so on. But the tactic isn't even to say be pro Bashar al-Assad, for example. The tactic is to say well, we don't know who did this, or we cannot ever know. We can't ever know what happened in Ghouta in 2013. Maybe it's the regime. If it is, we'll do something. But they don't say this. But maybe it's this, maybe it's that. But it's some shadowy group that no one has ever heard of that suddenly had military grade weapons at their disposal and that sort of thing. And the cynicism, that very, very deep cynicism, I think, and here I'm paraphrasing a mutual friend, Romeo Kochiatsky, who I think on my podcast, on his podcast, he mentioned that it's actually, it seems that it's Western Europe or America, whatever that has been Russified, quote unquote, and by which he means this very deep cynicism about the world, that it's not that it's not that even like the average Russian necessarily believes that Russia is the best best country on the planet. Is that, well, no other country can be better anyway, because there's no point fighting for anything better. There's no point expecting anything better, because it just doesn't exist and it will never happen. And I think the Russian state and its media apparatus understood this very well, that there was a deep cynicism in the West, especially in the context of Trump's election and Brexit, which obviously we know there's a Russian link there, especially in that entire context. And while at the same time, which was a perfect, amazing gift for them, the ISIS attacks were happening in Europe, while they were happening in Syria, no one really cared. But while they started in Europe, people started caring. That was like, it was the perfect package, essentially. It's cynicism, a fear of the other, existing Islamophobia anyway, actual terrorism, which just fed into all of that stuff. And so they were able to place themselves as like, the Americans or the West wanted to defeat Bashar al-Assad because he is anti-Israel or he is anti-America or whatnot, ignoring or purposefully erasing the fact that Bashar was actually actively involved in the post 9/11 extradition program of the CIA, which is not even a secret. These are open things, and they were boasting about it early on, but we tend to have a short memory. But anyway, I digress. All of this to say that this mixture of ignorance, cynicism, authoritarianism, because there is a lot of that in the West as well, it's also providing easy answers to a complicated world, and a lot of people don't want to have complicated answers, so they stick to the easy ones.
I mean, also the way that Russian disinformation works isn't to provide one solid counter-narrative. Mm-hmm. It's just to pollute the public space with so many possible explanations that nobody knows what to believe. And the effect of that is that it paralyses people and that it prevents people from having a clear idea of what's going on, and at the end of the day prevents people from being able to stand in solidarity.
Absolutely. And Ukraine and Syria and lots of other countries have been on receiving end of these tactics of disinformation for so many years, even before they arrived to the West. And back almost a decade ago, we were all warning them that this is something that will spread, and you will definitely feel the same kind of impact that we did if you don't stop it. And ultimately, of course, I personally believe at 100%, every Ukrainian as well, that we learned the hard way that fascism and colonialism can only be stopped by defeat, and by complete defeat on the battlefield. And only after they embarrassed by it, it will collapse. No other way is possible. So of course, through Ukraine victory in this very uneven battle, of course, there might be a way for other countries affected by Russian terror, Russian tyranny, and other countries affected by tyranny supported and funded by Russia will have seize a moment and chance to topple that as well. However, I wanted you guys to ask a question, like, how can Ukrainians, because we have a lot of Ukrainians listening here, and also in recent months, we started building a larger alliance and community of people coming from places that are feeling the effect of Russian colonialism, affected, has been, or still are. So all these people, how do you think we can all collectively help you as well in your work and important storytelling and explaining that you do constantly? And Leila, I cannot even imagine doing what we've been doing for 8 months to do it for over a decade, like yourself. But yeah, where do you think we fit in your fight and helping you to end this fascism and this terror that has affected your people in your region?
Yeah, well, like I said before, I think, building alliances built not on ideology but on shared experience, shared understanding is just so effective, and why discussions like this are so important, reaching out and learning from each other's experience and I hope that much more of these discussions continue. I mean, they have been happening. It was wonderful to see, like, the White Helmets giving so much practical advice to Ukrainian civil defence forces, and let's just hope that we can continue with this and really keep building strength and seeing common goals that we share common problems.
Yeah, I guess I can just echo this and just hope that the Ukrainian resistance is able to actually defeat the Russian state, because I think that's by far the most efficient thing that can happen right now. But yeah, I mean, what you're currently doing, and thank you for having us, like that's just, for me, like that's already a lot.
Yeah.
And what you're doing is also a lot for us, because no matter how hard it has been for such a long time, and I know we've also spoken about the way that we've seen the response to Ukraine be different to the response we've seen before. Like, it's just, we are so grateful that, disregarding that, we still, on a personal level, on a public space level, on a Twitter level, on so many different levels, we're supporting each other and giving each other advice, and Syrians and other people from Middle East as well. It's just been quite important, I think, for a lot of Ukrainians, and I hope that, one day we can support people in the same way as well. I hope no more wars happen again, but that's too idealistic. But I just, I'm super grateful for the support that everyone has been showing to Ukrainians.
Yeah, it's also not easy to find the time and the space to be doing stuff like that, this, because you're so absorbed into what's happening, the day-to-day reality of what's happening on the ground. And of course you have friends and family in this situation that are directly affected. So thank you for creating this space.
But it's also one of the surprises when we started doing bridge episodes and including allies. And of course we include allies who do a lot and empathize. But we started doing original Ukrainian spaces with Ukrainians. And we quickly figure out that even on most darkest days, when you're completely disoriented by everything that is happening with your home and your families, you still go to these spaces, and it works a bit of like a therapy. And when we started doing bridge episodes and started inviting people like you guys, the surprising thing that it also works as a therapy. I listen to you, and it gives me strength and more hope, and it gives me also really valuable practical insights how to keep resisting no matter what. And if you've been doing that for so long, I think this is something we can definitely do, and hopefully together we can bring this fascist empire down and have some peace at last for our people.
Thank you. I also certainly get a lot of strength from these kind of discussions, and a bit more energy and motivation to keep going, so that's great. Same here. I guess I can just say Slava Ukraini.
Heroям slava. This is definitely not the last conversation that we must have, and we'll have more on Syria, because
100%.
And because this is so important for understanding the story of Ukraine and the genocide and the horror that is happening in Ukraine. If you care about it, and we have so many people who care on every day, you should be caring about what's happening in Syria, and spend whatever energy you have might left for solidarity and asking your Syrian friends how you can amplify and support them while we have this platform, while we are trying to bring more attention to Ukraine. Wanted to thank our patrons as well, our patron family. This hour has been possible thanks to your support. If you're not a patron and you loved this episode, whether you're listening it live or whether you listen it as a podcast, please consider also supporting us with whatever you can spare, because we really value your support and we only survive thanks to it. If you're listening as a podcast, Ukrainian Spaces is a live event, but it's being recorded and then uploaded to now every possible podcast platform. And if you listened it to this point, go just rate us, give us some stars, give us some comments. This is so important for us to keep trending on the podcast platforms. And I also wanted to thank our a little but growing Ukrainian Spaces team. Also, Tatiana is here. We have Solomia with us now as well. Thank you guys. This also wouldn't be possible without you.
We have one final comment from one of our patrons that Tatiana is going to read out.
Hi, привіт. We have a comment from our wonderful patron, Margaret, and she says to us, thank you so much for connecting so many important dots in this space. It has been very educative and affirming of political and personal values to continue a decolonial standpoint. I love that. So thank you, Margaret.
Thanks.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us. The hour has passed really quickly, and I hope to have both of our wonderful guest speakers back to talk more about solidarity between Ukraine and everyone else. Thank you.
So we don't break the tradition. The last thing we always end with is Slava Ukraine.
Heroям слава.
Heroям слава. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.